delineation is important for all projects, avoidance, minimization, but once you get to that impact piece of the project's replacement is equally important. So I'm going to touch on a few of our revisions to the recently revised Massachusetts Inland Wetland Replacement Guidelines. So the initial document was published in 2002, so this is a 20-year update. I'm going to start with going over a few regulations and standards for the wetland replacement, and then I'm going to go over actually the first of two documents. The Wetlands Replacement in Massachusetts was a study performed by UMass Amherst and MassDEP that looked at the state of replacement, the successes and the shortfalls of that. And then with that information, we revised the Massachusetts Inland Wetland Replacement Guidelines. So I'm going to start with two slides with the regulations and the standards. The first slide here is kind of the overarching picture, and then my next slide will be more project specific. So the presumption of significance, all BVWs are presumed to be significant unless the issuing authority writes otherwise. Proposed work shall not destroy or impair the resource of the BVW, but then it's immediately followed by notwithstanding loss can occur if performance standards are met, and then I'll go over that here in a minute. And then the last one is no BVW impact can occur within areas of critical environmental concern. So these are the project-specific BVW thresholds here. Up to 5,000 square feet may be lost if replaced. The impact area and the replacement area must have similar groundwater surface elevation, configuration of bank. They must have an unrestricted hydraulic connection. And then we have a success standard here for the BVW replacement area. 75% must be reestablished with indigenous wetland plant species within 2 growing seasons. So the limited projects, they must meet the same success criteria. However, if it's impossible, then there's a little bit more flexibility. So the wetland replacement in Massachusetts, this was a study that was done by UMass Amherst and MassDEP. Looked at 5,000 NOIs submitted across the state between 2004 and 2008. Of these 5,000 projects, not all of them included replacement, and not all of them we could get site access. So we found a subset of 91 that had replacements, and we could go in and look at the site. So there's several key takeaways from this. The first one, 12 of these 91 sites weren't even built. And so I'll pause there. This is the first takeaway here, right? So when you have a replacement project, let's make sure they're built. The next one, 28 of the 79 sites that were built, there wasn't a wetland that was established. So it's another key takeaway. Let's make sure there's wetlands established. And then another point here too, 28 of the 28 sites where there wasn't a wetland, there was no hydric soils and no hydrologic indicators, but 25 of those sites did have hydrophytic vegetation. And so Scott said it first, Deb said it after that, plants can lie, and we need to look at what's going on with the water and the soils. So, not going to bury the lead here. Got a slide. Two main recommendations. Make sure the replacement sites are built, and then require adequate pre-designed site selection and hydrologic feasibility design. And so that's taking a look at what's going on at the site before you finalize that design, and making sure it's got adequate hydrology. So, with those takeaways from the 2018 Wetlands Replacement study, we revised the replacement guidelines. And all of this is to help the Concoms and the applicants make sure the replacement sites are successful. So our changes, this is relative to the first revision, the first iteration of the guidelines, which was published in 2002. So the majority of the changes occur in Section 2.2, Section 4, and Section 5. And I'll touch on all these briefly. Section 2.2, this is the replacement site selection. So this is before they finalize the design. We introduced a couple new ideas here. The first of which is the hydro period. It's the duration and the frequency of the inundation and saturation on the site. And I've got a few slides that will touch on that. We also introduced the Nowitzki wetland classification system. This breaks down all wetlands into just 4 types of wetlands. And those are based on the geomorphic position and the source of the water. So this is an example of what a hydro period year is for you. And I like this slide because it's got a relative kind of wetland ground surface, and then it's broken into the growing season. And what Deb just touched on was, we need that water, coming in contact with the soil during the growing season. And so the first, that 1985 one on the far left, you can see where the water surface elevation goes above the ground surface, right? So that's inundation or ponding. And then this one, 30 centimeters, that's 12 inches. And so we have a lot of water on that top line there. That's that saturation, that capillary fringe. And then the bottom line, that's a different wetland. It's a little bit drier. It has a hydro period that just dips into that top 12 inches, looks like once in over a 3-year period. So that hydro period might be kind of closer to the line rather than in the middle of the wetland. This is 2 examples here of what a different hydro period might look like. The one on the top is too dry. So we've got a ground surface, we've got that 12 inches that Deb talked about, and then we have the water depth here on the top graph. You see that water depth doesn't break into the capillary fringe. And so this site is too dry. This is not a wetland. But it might be a good replacement area because we can excavate down into that water table. The second one here, you can see ground surface, capillary fringe, and then you can see the water depth. Right? So we're standing in an inundated spot. It's inundated year-round, so we're standing in a pond, and that's not a wetland either. So we want to, when we're thinking about designing these wetlands, we don't want it to be too dry, we don't want it to be too wet. And so this might be indicative of a good replacement area in a design hydro period. So we have the growing season, could be March from October. We have a little bit of inundation there in May. In between April and June, we have saturation between that March and late July time frame. And then it dips below. It's drier, during the late summer, but that doesn't matter because we meet our minimum hydrologic needs. So now that you have a good idea of what a hydro period is and what it's looking for, like how do we develop one? And so we introduced this idea of the Nowitzki classification system. And so there's only 4 types of wetlands. We break them down into groundwater depression, groundwater slope, surface water slope, and surface water depression. For the groundwater depression and the groundwater slope, there's the same methodology to develop a hydro period for this. So we're just going to throw those together. Surface water slope, this is a type of wetland that's on a larger surface water, and that water fluctuates up and down, and that's the hydrologic influence. And then surface water depression, I'm not going to talk about these, but they are in the replacement guidelines. These are typical of what kind of isolated features in the headwaters. So groundwater depression here, this is near Newton, Massachusetts. This is the Charles River. There's some border vegetated wetlands here that's right next to the Charles, that's in between the groundwater depression pin and then the actual river. The groundwater depression, there's no streams flowing in or out. If this was isolated, this would be a good replacement site because it could be connected to the floodplain wetlands. Another example of a groundwater type wetland is a groundwater slope. So this is a 360-degree view. Look at it in one way, and turn around and take a photo the opposite direction. So there's a slope that's right here on the photo on the right, and then the water is flowing like towards me where I'm taking the photo. It ultimately flows into a stream that's off to the left of that right photo. Another groundwater slope example here. This is at Blue Hills in Randolph, Massachusetts. This is a 90-degree intersection with a stream that flows past it, and so there's you can see there's slopes on either side that feed that precipitation and that recharge into this feature. This is my last groundwater example. I like this cross-section here because you can see that groundwater connection. And so I've given you 4 groundwater examples, and all of these types of wetlands, we would develop a hydro period using the same methodology, and that would be one of these methods. And so I think you're probably thinking, wow, this is a lot of work. You know, what if we have just a residential project with just one house, right? So the amount of assessment you do before design should be commensurate with the amount of impact. And so for a small house project, you may just have a couple soil observation holes throughout the site and throughout the growing season. And then you can document what the water is doing. But say you have a project with, you know, an airport with larger impacts, so we might want to look at several different seasons worth of data. So that's when you might look at the observation pits, which are typically kind of excavated machines. Zombers, shallow groundwater observation wells are really good as well. So we're going to move on to surface water slopes here. I like this drawing because it shows where the water table is. So if we were to look at the groundwater on this site, it wouldn't tell us anything, right? Because the hydrologic contribution is from that lake and that river and that water surface elevation that's coming up and down. This is a photo, so I'm standing in the surface water. In the foreground, there might be a groundwater connection, but as that groundwater, as the wetland moves up the gradient, that groundwater recedes. And so then there's a wetland that continues up the slope, but it's that surface water, right, that is that hydrologic contribution. And that's what we want to capture. And so how do we develop a hydro period for that type of wetland? Staff gauges are really good, right? So you can see as the water moves up and down the staff gauge, you can document that. Scott had a good slide too about wetlands that are adjacent to large features like that. And then bankable indicators and USGS stream gauges. All right, so we now know what our hydro period looks like. We know how to develop one. Now we're going to move to design for these projects. What should we be considering, you know, while we're reviewing that applicant's submittal? Well, we've got to go back to the regs, right? Ideally, the surface area, groundwater, surface elevation of the impacted wetland and the replacement area are similar. We want to consider the minimum saturation and the maximum inundation. So that's the slide I had where it's a pond or it's too dry, right? We want to be somewhere there in the middle. And then if you have a site that's on a slope, and if you have an impact that's like below where you're going to put your replacement area or vice versa, like we want to consider that, right? So this is my Blue Hills example in Randolph, Mass. Hoping you can see that light blue line there, but that's the water depth. So that hydro period is taken in the middle of the wetland right there. It says at 167. Hydro period provided, already a wetland, right? We don't want to put a replacement site there because it's already a wetland. That's going to be an impact. If you are in that wetland and then you step up on the bank, right? You're probably 168, 169, and then you walk down the bank, you've got another 167, but that's not a wetland, right? So that might be a good place to put a replacement area. So how would we make that 167 a wetland? Right, so this is potential hydro period of what that 167 was, right? We've got it too dry, kind of fluctuating there below the capillary fringe. So what we want to do, we want to excavate down to the seasonal, either high water or low water, somewhere in between there. And there's some flexibility, right? So if it's a drier year that you have this data for, maybe you only have a couple points along in the growing season. If it's a drier year, maybe you go a little bit deeper. If it's a wetter year, maybe you go a little bit higher on that water table. It also depends on what type of wetland you're impacting, right? So there's deep meadow, there's marsh, swamp, and if it's a wetter wetland that you're impacting, then maybe you want to hit it a little bit lower. And I'll stop there. Are there any questions there? Okay. So, ultimately, if we have a hydro period, we know that depth that we want to excavate to, we've got to make sure that they're on the design plans. So if you're not familiar with design plans, we have a profile view, an aerial view here from the top. You see there's a black line that cuts across the plan diagonally, so that's the cross section. And then the cross section on the bottom here is shown. And so I've got the red arrow there. What we're looking for here is the proposed grade, the existing grade, the proposed grade, and then the high water and the low water, right? And so your existing grade is not a wetland. Your proposed grade is going to fall somewhere in between that high water and that low water spot. And then that way you'll make sure that it's excavated to the right depth. Sometimes you have a bigger site, right? And you want multiple cross sections if it's on a slope. So I've got 3 cross sections on this one. So there's 3 black lines, and that's on the aerial view of the plan. And I know you can't read those cross sections, but what it is, it's going to have an existing conditions. It's going to have a proposed conditions, right? That's going to excavate down, and then you're going to have that high seasonal water and that low seasonal water, and that proposed conditions is going to be somewhere there in the middle. Also, when you're looking at applications and submittals for these replacement projects, we should consider how we're going to monitor it after they construct it. So we're looking for either piezometers or, if it's a smaller project, then they can propose just hand-up pits as well. Something to consider when you're reviewing the application. So, moving on to another section here, construction and post-construction monitoring. So there's a link in these projects. There's the pre-design site selection, there's the design, there's the construction, right? And then there's the post-construction monitoring. Anytime that one of those links fails, then the whole project could potentially fail. And so there's a key part of keeping an eye on these projects during construction, right? Because you can get the design right, but if the contractor doesn't build it according to the design, then the replacement site fails. And so we want an environmental monitor present during the construction, or a conservation agent coming out just looking at things. And then we want data submitted. We want to review what's going on at the site after construction. So there's lots of different questions to ask as you're monitoring. And so, was it constructed per the design? Will it meet the performance standards? And does it meet the minimum hydro period requirement for a wetland? Right? So we don't want it to be too wet. We don't want it to be too dry. And sometimes, data can come to you in lots of different forms. This is a period of several different years that I've got this table here. And it shows above the ground surface there's some inundation, some ponding, and then within that ground surface at 12 inches, there's the capillary friends, the saturation. So we've got to go out on the site and monitor. Let's inspect our sites. Back to my earlier slide, we need to make sure the replacement sites are built first and foremost. We want to monitor early during construction, catch those potential errors, and then ultimately we want to look at the soils and the water, the monitoring results, because the vegetation can lie. This is my last slide for this presentation. It talks about alternatives to wetland replacement. And so for most projects, replacement is a requirement. DBW impacted, DBW is replaced. But for limited projects and various projects, there's a little bit more flexibility. For these projects, we can consider a different type of mitigation, dam removal, river stream restoration, tidal restriction removal, stream crossing improvements, culvert enlargements, reforestation, riparian buffer. So, yes?
If the primary purpose of the project is dam removal and the construction access and things like that is going to impact utility on a temporary basis, can dam removal still be classified as the replacement as well?
Right. So that most of those projects are ecological restoration type projects, and so they fall in a little different category than these. But that's a good question, and it just depends on what the impacts are, and it's very site specific. So.